All right, hi everybody. My name is Ashley Brittner-Wells. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Community Engagement Specialist for Community Planning, Development, and Innovation at the City of Missoula. We're the department that is leading the Our Missoula project, and we're just very happy to see all of you tonight. Before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about why I'm so happy that all of you are here through this project. We're really trying to focus on reaching a wide swath of Missoulians of all demographics, folks that this project will affect, which is all of us. This is a really exciting, kind of once-in-a-lifetime generational project, and we need the voices and support of all Missoulians, and so I'm just so excited to see all of you here tonight, and I hope that what you learn from this project and what you learn about this project you can take into your personal lives and day-to-day to your work and just let folks know, like, hey, this is an exciting thing to be a part of, and hopefully we will see you at future events and some of the folks that you know in your life as well. And so through our engagement philosophy, we're really trying to reach folks through collaborative education, lived experiences, sharing lived experiences, and just learning as we go and being iterative with this project and this process. So we hope to see you again, is what I'm trying to say. We hope this is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. And so with that, I am going to pass it to Emily. She's a senior planner on Our Missoula. We'll present some information, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll break out into groups and talk a little bit about some questions that relate to the information that you will hear tonight, but also things that you already know, things that you've experienced. So with that, I'll pass it to Emily, and we'll get started.
Thanks, Ashley. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Gluckin. As Ashley said, I'm a senior planner and one of the project managers on the Our Missoula project. I'm really excited to see you all here this evening. And disclaimer, I forgot my glasses, so if it looks like I'm squinting, I am, but I can see you all loosely. So bear with me as I make it through this. So yeah, let's kick it off. We're here tonight to talk about the equity and land use report that was just published. We have it available online. It's kind of a first of its kind report for the city, and we're really excited to share what we learned from it with you all tonight. But before we get into that, I want to start off with just giving you some background on what is the Our Missoula project and why we're here talking about it and why we're doing it right now. So, just start us off in what challenges we're tackling through this project. So the first challenge is that the city has a mission to promote equitable, sustainable, and quality growth and development. That's our mission statement. And as we're all aware, Missoula is experiencing significant pressures right now from growth that are creating a lot of challenges for our community. So one major goal of the Our Missoula project is that it will aim to both address the current challenges that we're facing and set us up so that any future challenge that comes our way, we're prepared to tackle that as well. And then the second reason for this project is that we are currently, as a city, not adequately implementing this equitable and sustainable vision of growth through our development codes. And we recognize this need to be responsive to this disconnect. So what Our Missoula does, is it provides us this path to update our development codes to better align with an updated policy. And this combination of updated policies and aligned codes is how we can achieve the outcomes we desire as a community. And those include, especially as they relate to the Our Missoula project, these goals are centered around equity, connectivity, climate, and housing. And just to ground us in what codes we're talking about here in this project, because there are a lot of city codes, the Our Missoula project is looking at any of the city's development codes that influence the city's physical built environment. So this includes things like zoning, subdivision regulations, street design standards, sidewalk requirements, parks and rec standards, boulevard requirements, all of that good stuff will be what we talk about in this project. And just for some orientation for where we are in this project, we are in phase 2 out of 6 total phases of this our Missoula project. And phase 2, which we're in right now, is really focused on defining the problem and helping us understand what are the existing conditions that we're working with, so then we can understand what we can change and where we can go from here. And the key topics that we will be exploring in this phase include the equity in land use report, which is what I'll be talking about today. We'll also be exploring some discussions around community forum, and a little later this fall we'll be talking about the overall usability and kind of functionality of our code. So let's jump into equity and land use. And I just want to start off with a little bit of background on why we're focusing on equity for this report. So in 2019, the city adopted a citywide housing policy, and this report called for the city to evaluate equity issues associated with land use codes and policies. And since 2021, the city has committed to addressing issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. You may be familiar with our JEDI resolution. And through that resolution, it calls for all city projects and city initiatives to apply what we're calling an equity lens to our projects. So this particular project is really exciting because it's kind of a first pilot project for this equity lens and applying it directly to a planning project. Oh, click again, there we go. And just to really boil it down to what we mean when we're talking about equity, we are referring to the definition that the city has used in this JEDI resolution, which is that equity is the full and equal access to opportunities, power, and resources so that all people achieve their full potential and thrive. This report and this analysis starts off with a look at Missoula's historical context. And the purpose of this is to help us understand how inequities of the past and systems that have historically existed in the city affect Missoula today. So we're going to go back to the very beginning here. From the start of human time, the area now occupied by the city of Missoula has stood at the heart of the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Upper Kalispé nations, which are the two easternmost tribes of the Salish language family. Both tribal and oral traditions and archaeological evidence indicate a presence here, and this includes a rich and beautiful cultural heritage that reaches back to the end of the last ice age and continues into our current day. And the place known in English as Missoula sits at the heart of far larger tribal territories. Across these vast areas, Salish and Kalispé people lived by a way of life that was based on a profound relationship with and a knowledge of the lands and waters, as well as with the plants and animals that inhabit them. They were and still are harvested within a culture of respect and ceremony, ensuring their abundance for generations to come. The spread of the fur trade in the 19th century brought what was really the first commodification of the natural world to the Northern Rockies and to the Missoula area. This commodification was part of a new Euro-American economic system that really initiated the transformation of what was the prevailing socioeconomic way of life that the Salish and Kalispé nations had known for thousands of years. And a key moment in the taking of tribal lands occurred in 1855 when U.S. officials and tribal leaders signed the Treaty of Hellgate. Under the terms of this treaty, which was plagued by poor translation and misunderstanding, the tribes ceded title to most of their lands west of the Continental Divide, while reserving as sovereign unceded territory both the Jocko or Flathead reservations and the Bitterroot Valley south of Lolo Creek. And through the treaty, the tribes also reserved the right to continue hunting, fishing, gathering plants, and pasturing their animals on open and unclaimed lands in the ceded areas. The Salish and Kalispé people were subjected to numerous injustices caused by the non-Indigenous newcomers. The newcomers rationalized and executed the dispossession of tribal land based on a system of land ownership, resource extraction, and profit that really had not existed in the area prior to that. And this is a stark reminder that rules about how land can be used and who can use land can inflict immense harm. Any consideration of social equity and land use in Missoula must be guided by a shared understanding of the original inhabitants of the valley for millennia, their profoundly different relationship with the land, water, and wildlife, as well as the cultural significance of the land that remains today. So I'm going to jump forward in history a little bit to when Missoula was really growing as a city in the 1900s, in the early to mid 1900s. This report took a look at some of the discriminatory practices of the real estate industry and government agencies that were not unique to Missoula. They were fairly widespread throughout the country during this time period. And these practices impacted where BIPOC families could live or buy property. The first example that we have up here is that real estate agents prevented BIPOC families from touring homes in mostly white neighborhoods and limited their options to certain neighborhoods that were more racially or ethnically diverse. Another example is that mortgage lenders would block access to home loans for BIPOC families if they wanted to buy a house in a mostly white neighborhood. And this is a term known as redlining. You might have heard that before. And a third and more explicit example is that in some neighborhoods, property owners and developers recorded legal restrictions, or these are also known as covenants, on specific properties that directly stated in that legal language that BIPOC households could not live in these homes or buy these certain properties. So while all of these practices are now very illegal under federal, state, and local laws, the impact of these practices occurring throughout this time period likely still play a role in explaining why Missoula's neighborhoods look the way they do today. So I'm going to shift us over to talking about some of our findings around housing affordability, and then talk a little bit about segregation and exclusion. So land use doesn't need to be explicitly discriminatory, like that covenant example, to create inequities in our community. So let's take a look at how land use and zoning in particular influences things like housing affordability. The first way is by encouraging builders to build larger homes, and larger homes are almost always more expensive homes. As an example, picture an empty plot of land in a zone that only allows one house per lot, and assuming there are no rules about how big or small that house can be, you may have the option to build a 3,000 square foot home or a 1,500 square foot home. In this situation, it is almost always more profitable to build that larger home than that one smaller home. But now imagine that on that same parcel, the zoning allows you to build 3 homes on that same empty lot instead of just 1 home. In most cases, buying and selling 3 smaller homes instead of 1 larger home would typically be more profitable, even if each of these houses are at a lower price point. And these houses would generally be more accessible to more people. So this concept leads to the second way that land use regulations impact housing affordability, which is by limiting the overall supply of housing in our community. So as we know from how supply and demand works, if the supply is low and the demand is high, that's when our housing costs and housing prices in the city are gonna go up. So I'm going to take you through some history of Missoula's zoning here, starting almost 100 years ago when our first zoning ordinance was established. And the purpose of doing this and kind of looking back in time is to help us understand how the shift in zoning relates to shift in housing affordability and housing access over time. So starting in 1932 on this map, about 75% of the city's residential land area allowed for multi-dwelling apartments. That's what you see in the orange on this map. And then growing and moving forward into 1948, a similar composition of these residential districts remained, and where we were really seeing growth was kind of around the center of the city in our commercial districts growing. And jumping ahead to 2022, and this is a visual of our zoning today. Nearly half of our residential zoning districts in the city are dedicated to exclusive single dwellings. And what happened was that as the city grew, many of the new zones were dedicated to this exclusive single dwelling housing, and many existing zones that may have previously allowed for higher densities with multi-dwelling buildings were what's called downzoned to then only allow exclusive single dwelling. And we call this out as an equity issue because today most households in Missoula can't afford a single dwelling house. The areas in our city that are zoned for exclusive single dwelling or a combination of single dwelling and duplex account for over 2/3 of the city's land area, but less than 1/3 of Missoula households can afford that. So that's a fairly large discrepancy that we really want to highlight as part of this report. And an inevitable consequence of this zoning pattern is that our city's neighborhoods are segregated in a variety of ways. So I'm just going to take you through a few examples of how we looked at this in the report, and I invite you all to take a look at the report, and we have a couple more examples in there. So this first one is showing the median household income in each neighborhood, so we can start to analyze how income is distributed throughout the community. And we also took a look at the percent of the population in each neighborhood that identified as a person of color. And for these examples and a few of the others that we examined in this report, when compared to the underlying zoning districts, we started to see the pattern emerge that, generally speaking, our exclusive single dwelling zones in the city tend to have higher income levels, less diversity, and higher access to education and opportunities. Whereas in our higher density areas of the city, those tend to have lower income levels, more diversity, and lower access to opportunity. So the final section I'm going to take us through is looking at displacement and gentrification. And before we get started, I just want to define these terms so we're all kind of speaking the same language here, and these are terms that you might have heard before and can be used in a few different contexts. So just want to ground us in what we're talking about, and I'm going to grab my notes very quickly. Okay, now we're talking. So displacement is when a household, kind of on the individual level, is forced to move out of their home or neighborhood due to rising rents or prices. And then gentrification is that, but on a kind of a neighborhood-wide scale. So gentrification is when rising rents or prices across a neighborhood result in an influx of higher income households, and this results in a changing overall demographic of the neighborhood. So this report includes an analysis of which neighborhoods may be currently experiencing gentrification or currently vulnerable to gentrification, so kind of a precursor to that happening. And we found that the areas that are currently vulnerable to gentrification but not yet experiencing it include the West Side, North Side, Riverfront, Rose Park, and Lewis and Clark neighborhoods. And then the areas we found that are currently kind of one step beyond that and experiencing early signs of gentrification are downtown Missoula and the northern end of the Franklin to the Ford neighborhood. And I just want to make a note that the areas that are unassigned, which is all of the gray that you see on the map, these very well may have populations that are vulnerable to displacement or pockets of areas that are experiencing changing demographics or hot housing markets, but comparatively in this kind of data model that was set up for this report, the areas in yellow and orange are the ones that kind of rose up to the top as especially vulnerable at the moment. And to conclude and I guess give us some hope for moving forward, we have 6 principles that were developed to help guide us as we're moving through this process and updating our policy and thinking about redesigning our codes to consider to advance equity in our city. And let's see if I can move this. So these range from distributing opportunities for affordable housing types broadly throughout the city rather than in specific areas of the city. From that example, between a parcel that might allow just 1 house versus 3 houses, the principle for us to consider is how we can allow higher densities that would allow those smaller, more accessible homes more broadly. Thinking about those areas of the city that are currently vulnerable to displacement or experiencing gentrification, we really want to be mindful that the reforms that we're creating are not exacerbating the problems that those particular areas are currently experiencing. Our 4th principle to keep in mind is designing effective incentives for income-restricted affordable housing, so the permanently affordable housing that would be accessible to our low-income residents. This 5th principle is something that we're going to be talking about with the community a little bit later into the fall, so this is kind of a taste of where we're going with this, but the idea is to focus our regulations more on the form of buildings and less so on density just as a number. So if you have questions about that, that is definitely something we're going to be exploring more in depth as we're moving through this project. And then finally, thinking about people's access to opportunities and services and amenities throughout the community, we want to make sure that we're designing policies and codes that make those available to everyone throughout the community citywide. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Ashley, who's going to introduce our discussion activity.
Awesome. So if you're watching on MCAT, this is where you can get the link in the description of the video to go to our website to answer these questions and engage and leave your comments. For us in person, we're going to break out into like 5 groups, so 3 or 4 folks per group. And we have folks from the city that will help lead a discussion around these 4 questions and any questions that might come up for you. So if you want to just kind of sort yourselves into groups of 4 or 5, we can get started with the discussion.